Good afternoon. Let me welcome you to the fourth in a series of seminars entitled The Future of Food. My name is Sam Ricardo. I'm the Associate Dean for Academic Programs in the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences. If by some chance you missed some of the earlier presentations, they will be online shortly, so you can at least view them over the web. I'm really pleased today. You recall we had our speaker scheduled in February, and as fate would have it, the weather did not cooperate, but we're grateful that Dr. Ricardo Salvador is with us today. Ricardo is the Director and Senior Scientist for Food and Environment Program for the Union of Concerned Scientists. He grew up in southern Mexico and received his BS degree in Agricultural Science from New Mexico State, and then went on and did his graduate work in crop production and physiology from Iowa State University. He was then involved in extension at Texas A&M University, and then was an associate professor of agronomy at Iowa State. And while he was there at Iowa State, he was the first chair of the graduate program in sustainable agriculture. He also has served as a program officer for food, health, and well-being with the W.K. Kellogg Foundation. And he is also the 2013 recipient of the James Beard Foundation Leadership Award. And one bit of trivia about our speaker today: he is a dedicated runner and runs approximately 2 to 6 marathons annually. So he has assured me he has great ability to sustain his presentation today. Would you please welcome our speaker, Dr. Ricardo Salvador.
Thank you very much, Sam. Appreciate it. Probably one right there. Thank you very much, Sam, and thank you very much to all of you for coming out and for your interest in this topic. This is a topic which is very much one of the issues of our time. It is serious business in many ways, and what I would like to impress upon you by the time that I'm done is that food is at the intersection of many things, and probably I can summarize that it's at the intersection of the American project itself. At least this is the case that I would like to make. By which I mean literally that it is at the core of our being able to fulfill the vision of the pursuit of life and happiness and liberty. And I would like to start out talking about this perspective of food by reminding ourselves of the way that we experience food on a daily basis. And I think the reason why this is important is that the food system has been such a resounding success as an intentionally designed project, as a vision that has come to fulfillment, that many times those of us that were not involved in launching that project can lose perspective of the fact that the system did not always exist. So the way that most of us experience this system is one of two ways, just generalizing very broadly. We either go someplace where we simply just imagine what we would like to have. And no matter what it is that you imagine, here in Raleigh, North Carolina, or in the surrounding area, wherever you are, whether it's in season or not, whether it grows here or not, whether it's fish or fowl, whatever it is that you want, you can have. Usually within about 5 or 20 minutes. The other way that we experience the system is that we'll go, maybe once a week, to a supermarket where we get to browse among 50,000 different items for just those items that we like, that we're accustomed to, that we identify with our childhood, that we've become attached to, that give us satisfaction and fulfillment. And we take those home, and for many of us, the major criteria for selecting those items is that when we bring them out at home to assemble them into a meal, we're not planning to spend more than about maybe 10 to 20 minutes in order to get a meal out of those basic elements for food. So there's lots of things that we can say about the system, but one of the things that we can say is that it is a manifestation of great power. Even though as you sit and eat, you may not feel like you're powerful, you may just be feeling, boy, this is good. It's just what I wanted. It hits the spot. The fact is that the logistical system that is behind this system to supply you with whatever it is that you imagine, without giving prior notice, just thinking, I would like to have X, I'd like to have Korean, or maybe Italian, maybe Mexican, whatever it is that you want, you can have. This is a manifestation of great power because it means that materials and energy from the entire planet are floating to you and converging upon you just to sate that potential desire, whether you express it or not. It has to be ready to deliver to you. So this is an important key to understand the claim and the title that may have drawn some of you to understand why the notion that there's a huge emergency in the future around food compels us to go all out in terms of production. And I'll make the argument that it's nothing but a marketing slogan, or anybody that pronounces it seriously doesn't understand the food system. So this is where we're going by the time that we get done. So let's talk a little bit now, having at least made the argument that what we have here is the manifestation of great power, about drivers of the food system, and they can be known. And so, let's see if I can get the remote to respond to me here. That's right. When I eat, I'm powerful, not when I want to advance the slide. Okay. So the subject of this very excellent series that Sam has set up is the future of food. And the great thing about this question is that one can approach it, as many people do, in terms of trend being destiny. In other words, we're on some sort of trajectory, and that's what the predetermined future of food is. But the neat thing is that it really is up to people to decide what the future of food is. And one argument that I'll make is that we are entitled to be the people, or at least some of the people, that make that decision, what the futures of the food system should be. But there are some known drivers, and so you're familiar with these, and I just want to draw them out. So one of them is the rise of supermarkets, such a commonplace thing for those of us in this country, and any of those of us that come from the wealthy sector of any country around the world. So if you think about this, this is replacing regional markets, traditional foods. Total value chains that deliver to different outlets are being replaced by this system because typically the two do not coexist, with certain exceptions, or at least not for very long. Another driver of the contemporary food system is that we are expecting food to be available year-long. So no matter what it is, as I mentioned earlier, that we desire, we expect that when we walk into that grocery store, it is going to be there. Or at least some species, some variety of it is going to be there. Another driver of the food system is that we expect to have, for the aforementioned reasons, a very extended shelf life. So this implies a lot of processing of the food and the utilization of lots of preservatives. Another driver has to do with the fact that for the majority of us, the thing that we're really buying when we go to any of these places to get our food is convenience. We're saving time. And so this is a huge driver of the food system. There are some logical consequences of all of these drivers, including the single largest expenditure that the food business sector makes itself, which is marketing. There are very well-known and utilized techniques to get us to buy whatever it is that they're pushing that particular week, that particular month, or that particular day, or for a particular meal. So these are the drivers. And in just a few minutes, we'll talk about one of the logical extremes of just saying these are setting a trend, we're on some trajectory that's unmodifiable, and it's going to take us to a particular food destiny. But before we get there, what I'd like to do is focus on a slightly different idea. Again, if we can get a response here. And that is simply to get beyond marveling, just stopping for an instance and marveling at the system that's in place, and reminding ourselves not only that it was not always that case, and that still, in many parts of the world today, that is not the food system, still. And in this country, the major driver in the past, what set this system up, what our predecessors specifically intended to address when they began to design the system that's in place, was driving poverty. And the fact that the majority of the population was rural, and that the majority of the population spent in a gender-assigned way the majority of their waking hours figuring out how to produce the food, how to process it, how to preserve it. And so one of those individuals is somebody who had a great deal of influence on the story, And he was an individual that got into a position of being able to do something about that, and it's very clear that he was someone that had spent many hours on the pointy end of a team of horses and had asked himself many questions. One that I can imagine is that there's got to be a better way than this. And the reason why I'm imagining that is that actually don't require a whole lot of imagination. He actually tells us so himself. So when he was campaigning to become president, he gave a speech at a fair in Wisconsin, and at this speech he was addressing a crowd of farmers, and the very interesting thing about that speech is that he didn't pander to the crowd of farmers. As a matter of fact, he starts out the speech by saying, "I'm not going to pander to you," which is a very unusual thing for a politician, not to curry favor. And remember, at that time the majority of the population are farmers, and he basically says, "I expect that you know I don't know more about farming than you do, but I have had some experiences farming, and here are some of the thoughts that I had while I did that." So he starts out by saying, "My first suggestion is an inquiry as to the effect of greater thoroughness in all the departments of agriculture than now prevails in the Northwest. Perhaps I might say in America." Now, at that time, the Northwest is the border of the United States in Wisconsin. And he goes on, you know, there's so many choice passages in here, and I just want to quote you a few of these so that you get a feel for this. So, for instance, here's one passage where he says, "It is certain that thorough cultivation would spare half or more than half the cost of land, simply because the same product would be got from half or from less than half of the quantity of land. The proposition is self-evident and can be made no plainer by repetition or illustrations. The cost of land is a great item, even in new countries, and constantly grows greater and greater in comparison with other items as the country grows older." Here's another passage. Again, "A great amount of locomotion is spared by thorough cultivation." By thorough, which he's using a lot here, in the modern parlance, let's replace the word efficiency. This is what he's talking about. "Take 50 bushels of wheat ready for harvest, standing upon a single acre, and it can be harvested in any of the known ways with less than half the labor which would be required if it were spread over 5 acres. So he's very much thinking about expending as little labor as possible, which was the limiting quantity for him, the limiting resource, in order to be able to produce more and to harvest more. If you're interested in having a review at this, unfortunately right now we don't have time to get into it in greater depth. I'll just mention to you that what he does here is essentially set up the template for a school like the College of Agriculture here at North Carolina State, where there is a department now devoted to every one of the issues that he mentioned to this particular group. There's a department devoted just to issues of weed science, just to issues of plant pathology, just to issues of entomology, just to issues of crop production, maybe even just to soil science. But most colleges have about maybe 16 of these departments, the number that you have here. And this was something that he foresaw, and as I mentioned, he got into a position where he was able to do something about that. So that's something that, in order to understand the story of where we are right now and how we got into a position where I could possibly make the very heavy critique that I'm about to make here, somebody intentionally started out with a very logical proposition. So when he got into the presidency, he, as you know, was a very individual, had a very busy individual. There were lots of ambitions that he needed to fulfill. And he went about establishing institutions. And yeah, thank you. Prior to this time, the Department of Agriculture was essentially a file cabinet in the Copyright Office where seeds were kept. It was very important to trade seeds at that period of time. It was one of the ways in which farmers shared resources. In that very same year, he established the system that eventually led to the foundation of this college, so that now not only is there a department for every one of these, you know, there's over 70 of these, and spread out throughout the country, together with a mechanism for resourcing them. And he also established the National Academy of Sciences with the express mission to inform Congress with science when science was the way in which proper decisions should be made about policy. Now, if you look at those years, you realize that he had certain other preoccupations on his mind, yet he was very focused on these ideas that he determined when he was a young man needed improvement. So this was the launch of the project that made powerful the manifestation of that great power. It was the root of the concept that then utilizing public resources and the energy of this country created a system that has now become global, which has been replicated, copied around the planet. And just drawing out some of the very few essentials, one of the first things that needed to be done, again something that Lincoln did, was of course sealing the deal for the Transcontinental Railroad, also with land grant tactics, mechanization in order to reduce drudgery, particularly traction over soil. So time disappeared, and then the ability to transport meat and perishable produce through refrigeration, although to this day we still don't really understand hybrid vigor. We learned how to manipulate it. During the period of the Second World War, a lot of the technologies that were developed for wartime became adapted later for agriculture, and you know, for instance, that bombing technology became fertilizer technology, at least for nitrogen, and that certain chemicals that were developed for chemical warfare became today's insecticides, or some of the insecticides utilized in agriculture. But the point is that all of these things eventually came together, and you see the tremendous takeoff in productivity after all of these different elements, some developed for different reasons, but all of them with public investment, you know, whether it was the Department of Defense or the Department of Agriculture. All of these things helped to put together a logistical system which taught us, with the objective of keeping a standing army in the field, how to distribute material and food throughout the entire planet. And these were the essential elements, so that in the late 50s, early 60s, you can see this agricultural takeoff. Now, I mentioned a few minutes ago that if you think about those 5 drivers of the food system that we talked about, that there is a predictable end, that if you essentially just extrapolate those things and you think, well, we're looking for convenience, we're looking for long shelf life, we're looking to save time, all these sorts of things, then there is a logical endpoint.
I believe in the molecular synthesizer of some kind, similar to a protein sequencer, far more advanced in water, cold. I saw a similar device in a Tarkalian vessel. It was capable of replicating almost any inanimate object.
I wonder what else is on the menu. One pan-fried catfish. Sounds like the real thing. Well, not bad. I doubt there's a catfish within 130 light years.
So the introduction of the original Starship Enterprise crew to the food replicator. Now, I don't know how many of you geek out over these topics and ask yourself how they did that. You just heard a brief explanation there, but at least when this technology was originally developed for purposes of the show, the way that it worked was that there was this pap, there was this paste, and it was formulated by nutritionists, and it was formulated so it was exactly the nutrition that human beings need. And it was stored in the hold, and whenever you asked for something to be replicated, you'd essentially just speak, and that would be molded, flavored, texturized, and out it would pop. And so that was the original techniques. Now, later on they got more sophisticated about this by the 24th century, but let's just stay with what they discovered at this point, or what they made happen. Now, you can see the claim that this is the logical endpoint of those current drivers of the food system, to the extent that actually there's research going on in terms of how to do this. So the project that's called Fab at Home is using 3D printing at Cornell University to manufacture such things as the Enterprise Scallop Fried, which was relatively easy to do because it's homogeneous material. And of course, the coming versions of this will become more intricate, layering, creating interiors, exteriors, and so on. Their next project evidently is pizza. And I'll show you a version of this food replicator, this one from Michigan University. Notice the syringes that are printing out the foodstuff, and notice that they must be connected to a source. A very important thing to remember, where's this pap coming from? So the pap is in the graph behind this. So the argument that I'll make throughout probably about the next 15 minutes is that we're in a situation where we're overproducing. Our major problem, and primarily commodity agriculture, is overproduction and figuring out what to do with that overproduction. And this is pap, the stuff that we're overproducing at the moment. So the problem has been to find out what to do with it. So, you know, you are accustomed to reading the standard contents of most processed food. So there's the starch, there's the maltodextrin, there's the sweeteners, there's the emulsifiers, there's the isocitrate, all of it, corn and soy. So it's not very far from this particular concept. And as a matter of fact, you are eating this sort of stuff already, extruded, manufactured, and having nothing to do with actual foods. And if you saw it, it wouldn't be too much removed from the concept of the replicator. Now, so that's one particular destiny for the food system, that you could just wish for whatever you want and not think what's connected to the syringes. Where is this stuff coming from? Well, so let's think about this a little bit. The system that we have in place right now was the result of intention, and so I want to look in very great detail at what that intention was, how it was manifested. And so the tools that were used for this were essentially policy tools. Policy is the ability to direct resources toward a particular end. And these were public resources, tax dollars, that were used to do just about everything that I've listed in terms of establishing this system. So you would expect that for the investment of public resources, there would be great public benefit. And so let's take a look at this. So this area that we're looking at very closely here is the era before that agricultural takeoff in productivity. And we're looking at it because there's great variability there. And at that time, that variability meant there was success or failure on the farm, not just that there were higher yields and lower yields. And it represented boom and bust cycles, but at a very low level of productivity. So this was the problem to solve initially. So let's take a look at some of the policy instruments, and we'll unfortunately just have to blur through these. The very first policy instrument that I'm choosing to draw out here was the Indian Removal Act, which actually had great effect in this part of the country dating back to 1830. Very transparently, very helpfully named. So there is no explanation needed here, but it is a major land grab. And so we begin with public policy appropriating land. Some of this land is actually made available to invaders. So in 1862, the Homestead Act in the Midwest apportioned 160 acres west of the Mississippi, again, something else that Lincoln signed, after having to take care of the population that was essentially enacting homeland defense on their own behalf. And so the area was colonized, and then followed a period of time when massive public investment was made in order to relieve farmers when there were losses due to natural disasters. And at the time, it was not really well received on the East Coast for a number of different reasons. It was seen as socialism, and it was seen as trampling the rights of the market. This happened to be around the period of time when intensive agriculture led to severe environmental consequences. And so the Soil Conservation and Domestic Allocation Act was implemented in 1936 in order to try to deal with that. And at that time, the very first echoes of an intention that transcends to this date began to be uttered, which was, if the government expends resources to support farmers on the land, is the government within its rights to expend or to expect that those farmers will then enact certain practices, such as conservation practices. And it's been a struggle in every major piece of farm legislation to follow through on that particular expectation. You'll know that in the particular version of the Farm Bill that just passed, there's agreement on that, and there hadn't been for a period of time prior to that. Now, we're going to have to speed up through here, and so what I'll do is basically talk about the fact that there were experiments throughout this entire period, once we got into agricultural takeoff, about what to do about that surplus, about overproduction. There is entirely recognition that, as with any other industry, when you overproduce, you need to reduce productive capacity. But here we were talking about farmers. So the question was how to do that. So do you control supply? Do you somehow manipulate demand? What is it that you do in order to be able to allow farmers to remain on the land, but yet avoid overproduction? And so, to make a long story short, the formula that was eventually arrived at after lots of different policy experiments was the formula of finding uses for that overproduction. The Supreme Court ruled that it was not lawful to prevent farmers from producing as much as they could to control supply. And so, the tactic became to figure out what to do with the surplus. And so, such tactics as the school lunch program, such tactics as, for instance, plastics from cornstarch, biofuels, sweeteners. These were all the ways in which we're attempting to sop up that overproduction because of the fact that we must produce as much as we can because we can, you know, in contravention to the way in which the logic of the market works for any other industry. Now, there might be some rationalizations for that, and if there's time, we can come back and talk about that a little bit. But export was obviously one of the other major sinks that the Department of Agriculture latched onto in order to sop up that tremendous productive capacity of the Midwest and of areas like North Carolina. By the way, as many of you know, the system that was perfected and then expanded to large scale in the Midwest was actually a system that originated here in the Piedmont of North Carolina and went over the mountains into the Nashville Basin, up into the Scioto, eventually reached into the Midwest. But this notion of growing corn, feeding it to livestock, and then selling those livestock was something that was first innovated here. And so we are marching through lots of detailed farm policy stories here, all to the point of basically concluding with the following. So, the miracle came about as a result of the investment of public resources. It was intentional, and it included 3 steps. One was this euphemism of making affordable land available. Now, I'll come back and talk about that euphemism. It's a very important component of this. So making affordable land available. And then investing major public resources in infrastructure, things like the railroads, the land grant system, and in research, the knowledge that Lincoln specified we would need in order to increase thoroughness or efficiency. And then, thirdly, to provide market supports, to help farmers to sell the abundant and successful produce that they were generating. So that project has been a resounding success. We can call it a success and move on to something else. But those programs are still in place as if they were still necessary, as if it were still the 1920s or the 1930s. And what has happened is that some of the largest, most successful business enterprises on the planet have now become dependent and actually protective of this government investment in their business. It's part of their business model. You're criticizing their business if you talk about the best utilization of public resources. That's a very important characteristic of the structure of the modern food system. So it's a summary to keep in mind. Now, here's what we have as a result of doing that. So it started out with the very best intentions, and we can call it a success and move on. Oxfam in January, very recently, put out this report that's called Good Enough to Eat. And in essence, they looked at 125 countries of the world. And what they did was map the characteristics of the system on several different indicators, which I hope to be able to show you here. Okay, so across the top of the table, you see that they look at affordability, at food quality, at diabetes, and obesity. And of course, the first important criterion is sufficiency. So let's take a look at each one of these. So there's the United States so that you can easily spot it. So in terms of overall score, the United States, just like everyone in this room would expect, scores extremely high, among the best countries in the world. We would expect it. And then when you take a look at sufficiency, again, you would expect that the United States is among the top in the world. When you look at affordability, again, you would expect that. Now, notice, affordability. It's not price. It's a ratio of cost to ability to purchase, to income. So on that score, the United States does very well. And then when you sort by food quality, again, the United States is in the first tier of countries. And then when you look at health, the quality of the food system in terms of public health, the United States is among the worst countries in the world, along with Jordan, with Mexico, with Fiji, some of the countries that have the most explosive runaway obesity and other metabolic disease. And as a matter of fact, it isn't just Oxfam that's looking at this. The National Academy of Sciences just recently, at the end of last year, published this report, U.S. Health and International Perspective, comparing the top 17 wealthiest countries in the world. 17 is an odd number, and that's because they had to go that deep into the list of the wealthiest countries to get to the United States. So of the top 17 wealthiest countries, the United States is the worst in terms of the quality of its food system for public health. The title says it all: shorter lives, we're living less due to premature death, which is preventable owing to the way in which we eat, and we live for longer periods of time with chronic disease, human-induced disease. So, Mark Bittman took stock of that state of affairs, and he's very good at pithy summations of complex information, and made this observation. This observation. It's very hard to imagine having a food supply that is abundant as ours is and doing a worse job with the thing. So, it doesn't have to be this way. We know enough to make things different, to make things better. So, let's think about this a little bit. This is the cost that he's referring to. Diabetes, which was six-tuple since the 1960s. Again, remember, that's when the agricultural takeoff manifested. Has a public cost of $92 billion. And likewise, when you take a look at obesity, that cost is $147 billion. These are CDC figures. They're getting a little bit dated. They're probably underestimating the actual figures, but because they're the official figures, they're the ones that we all use. And here's the number one killer of Americans: 170,000 preventable deaths a year at a cost of $444 billion. I mean, just think about the impact on the public treasury of that. So we pay for this production, we pay for the maintenance of chronic disease, and then we pay for the cost of these premature deaths. In the case of cardiovascular disease, the cost in terms of lives is $170,000 a year. So this is what this system has done. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking people just need to take care of themselves, make better choices. So let's delve into that. So I mentioned a while back that what we're really buying when we go to buy this stuff is convenience. We're saving time. That's what most of us are thinking about. So this is a plot of the distance to the nearest McDonald's in the entire United States. And, you know, they're just emblematic of this system. So not picking on them in particular, and I'm sure you'll appreciate this as I go through, but, you know, they are the leaders of the industry that they created, and so they're a nice one to take a look at in terms of their impact. So what I want to do is to ask you to join me, and let's take a look at this personal choice thing. You can choose whether you're going to take care of yourself or not. So you run around, you're busy, you're hungry, you have 20 minutes, you think, I got to pick up something someplace. There's a McDonald's, you just saw the map, you're not very far at any time, and so in you walk. Now, you're all experts, particularly those of you that are the college crowd, so you know, you may help me with this experience here. But here we are at the McDonald's, and so I walk in, and I want to do as little damage as possible, so I'm looking to see what the options are, and so take a little closer look. So look at this. Look at number 4. Yeah, now you may look at whatever you want. I'm not sitting you up here, but the reason I'm looking at number 4 is that, look, that's 2 cheeseburgers. It's not just 1 cheeseburger. And look, I can get the meal, which means I can get fries and my choice of drink. I can get that for $5.29. And now the calories are going to be anywhere between 980 and 1220 calories. You know, that's about running a half marathon. And the thing is, I can eat those cheeseburgers, fries, and the soft drink. I can probably, you know, polish that off in 15 minutes. It'll take me about 2 hours to run a half marathon. So that's the thing to remember about the importance of physical fitness against the way that you're eating and how you balance those things. And just think, this is 1 meal during the day, you know, against 2,000 calories that somebody about my size actually needs. So, you know, I'm thinking about that. Yummy hamburger, it's hot, you know, the smell of the fries and the burgers just wafting all over the place, you know. But I'm saying, look, I need to take care of myself, so where are the salads? So let's take a look at this. Okay. So look, it looks like the one with the lowest caloric content is the Caesar salad. I don't really want something with bacon. And I can get grilled or crispy chicken. So I'm going to go with the Caesar salad. It's $4.69. I'm going to skip the salad dressing. I'm really trying to watch it here. I'm going to go with fruit and walnuts. So vegetable-based oils are healthy for me. I need them for my membranes. Just 210 calories there, 350 calories for the salad, but it's $1.99. Now, this is not a meal, so I still have to get something to drink. So, now wait a minute. $4.69 plus $1.99. So, let me go back and take a look at these 2 cheeseburgers there. $5.29 plus a drink and fresh fries. So, what am I supposed to do here? Well, let's take a look at what's going to happen once I add the drink here. So again, I'm taking care of myself. Now, I probably am going to go with the water here. I don't want the syrup and the fruit juice. And, but look at the soft drink. So for $1.49, I can have a small. For just 20 cents more, I can have a medium. For just 20 cents more, I can have a bucket of soft drink. So who walks into a McDonald's and asks for the small? It's sort of like un-American. You're getting less than you could get. But I'm going to be disciplined. I'm going to go for the water. It's $1.79. So there's the free choice that I make. So I walk into a McDonald's, try to do the healthy thing. I get this chilled salad. It's nowhere near as flavorful or as enjoyable, even though I know it's more healthy for me, than that burger. So what McDonald's is specialized for, I'm not faulting them for this, and let's not fault them for this. They're specialized in delivering that warm, piping burger, within a minute of when you say that you want it. Their own internal surveys show that about 66% of their customers do not feel good about eating at a McDonald's. And when asked why, it's because they know that it's not healthful and they would like to have fresher food. But the thing is, McDonald's wasn't created for that. They've got a huge problem because they don't have the logistics to deliver fresh fruits and vegetables. That's not what they're about. But they have to deal with this because the demand from the public is shifting. But let's go back to my story. So my story is that if I go for the meal, I'm going to expend $5.29. If I go for the Caesar salad, the fruits and walnuts, and the water, I'm spending $8.47. Now, of course, my problem is I try to go into McDonald's to eat healthfully. I'm going to acknowledge that. But if you just go with the argument, you just need to watch what you eat. Take care of yourself. Now, I know you're probably thinking, okay, you're setting this up. So let's take out the fruit and walnuts so that we're not actually sandbagging here. So I take out the fruit and walnuts, and I'm just getting water and a Caesar salad for crying out loud, and it's more than 2 cheeseburgers, fries, and a choice of drink. Now, how is that possible? Now, there's actually lots of reasons. One of the reasons is that the stuff on the right is more perishable. There's more shrinkage and loss there. And I also mentioned the specialization. But there's also another reason for this, and that is that it really is a whole lot cheaper for McDonald's and everybody else that sells you that pap over there to do that. And here's the reason. Let's take a look at what the government recommends that we ought to be eating. I really tried to do this on my visit to McDonald's. So this is not me, a foodie. This is what the Center for Nutrition and Promotion within the Food and Nutrition Unit of the USDA, informed by a formal study of the Institute of Medicine, the top nutritionists and doctors specialized in nutrition in the country recommend that we eat this way. And they also had to bow to politics. This is a politically shaped plate. But they did pretty good. So then what it says is that half of that plate ought to be fruits and vegetables. And you ought to eat meat sparingly, and it should be lean meat. Protein there is politically negotiated so that they could avoid having to get into the wrangles about what type of meat. Because the recommendation would have been eat more chicken or pork or grass-fed beef to get your lean meat, and whole grains. Again, the Harvard School of Public Health, instead of dairy, would have water up there. But here's what our own government recommends that we eat. So this is what they tell us that we should eat, and let's compare that against what they actually support. I think the NSA is having something to do with it. Try again. Okay. Here's what the government actually supports. So this is for the last Farm Bill, year 2008 and 12. If you look at the way that agricultural subsidies are actually expended, 80% go into the production of that PAP that I mentioned, corn and other grains and oils. That's corn soy that you see there as that 80%. Look at what goes into fruits and vegetables. Less than 1/2% of the $5 billion annual that go into support of agricultural production. So it's not only just that, it's that if you proposed in the Midwest to produce more fruits and vegetables, you would lose some of your corn and soy base. And the fact is that, as we'll see in just a little bit, very little land in the Midwest would produce all the fruits and vegetables that this country would need during the summer. And California fruit and vegetable farmers know that. So they're plenty happy to approve this, to let this go on, as long as there are prohibitions in terms of Midwestern farmers' ability to actually produce fruits and vegetables, or else they lose access to those subsidies. So that's the deal. Policy instruments. Okay, so we have done an analysis of the situation. Many of you picked up the analysis. It's referred to as the $11 trillion reward. Now, I'm an agronomist. The purpose for my life is to shift the agricultural system into one that provides us food that is nourishing, that doesn't exploit people, that doesn't exploit nature, and that's affordable to all of us. That's what I'm about. But I'm not going to talk about any of that because I think that's going to bore 312 million people in this country. But if instead we talk about wasting government money, if instead we talk about the toxic effect of the food system on all of us, then I have fiscal conservatives that are interested in that inefficiency. Then I have moms that are interested in what they could be doing better for their children. So this is what this analysis does. So let's have a look at what the conclusions done by two of our economists.
We've all heard that an apple a day keeps the doctor away. But what if I told you that same apple could save hundreds of thousands of lives and billions of dollars every year? You see, 725,000 Americans die each year of coronary heart disease, heart failure, and stroke. This costs American families and taxpayers $94 billion in medical costs treating those diseases. But what can our humble apple do about this? The latest scientific research shows that if Americans ate just one more serving of fruit or vegetable a day, we would prevent 30,000 premature deaths each and every year, just from heart diseases and strokes. And we'd save $5 billion in national medical costs related to those diseases. That's enough to buy a year's worth of groceries for 1.8 million Americans. Now let's back this up for a moment and see what happens if the apple called in some friends and Americans started eating enough fruits and vegetables to meet the federal government's dietary recommendations. We could prevent 127,000 deaths each year. That's about the population of a city like Topeka, Kansas, which would save a whopping $17 billion annually in national medical costs related to stroke and heart disease. In fact, economists say that people living their full lives, enjoying their families in full health, is worth an astounding $11 trillion. Our apple doesn't seem so humble anymore. But here's the problem. Current U.S. food policy stacks the deck in favor of junk foods while making healthy foods like fruits and vegetables more expensive. The U.S. government spends billions of dollars subsidizing farmers who grow corn and soybeans, which are used to make unhealthy processed foods. At the same time, government policies put up roadblocks that make it harder for farmers who want to grow the fruits and vegetables we need. In the end, taxpayers wind up paying twice for our unhealthy food system, once to subsidize junk food, and again to treat diet-related diseases like heart disease and stroke. It's no wonder that both fiscal conservatives and health professionals are up in arms. Even as the U.S. government is encouraging us to eat the right stuff, they're subsidizing the wrong stuff, and it's killing us. How can you help? As individuals, we can and should try to choose healthier foods, but there's more we can do. Contact your congressional representatives and urge them to favor investments in healthy food. instead of subsidizing unhealthy processed foods that are making us sick. Team up with the Union of Concerned Scientists at ucsusa.org/healthyfood. Your heart and wallet will thank you for it.
I have to remember what comes next. Okay. So let's take a look at a few other aspects of the food system as it has resulted, because I've said it doesn't have to be this way. We need to know why it is the way that it is in order to do away with this notion that trend is destiny and remake the food system the way that we know it can be, the way that is better for all of us. So here's something that I alluded earlier on, the difference between food being inexpensive and food being affordable. So here's a figure that many people often quote, which is what the cost of food is on an annual basis as a share of disposable personal income as an indicator of how cheap food is. A very different thing from affordability. But from the standpoint of what has happened to this is the trend that almost everyone appeals to here, that Americans are expending 10% or less annually of their income in order to procure their food. But this is a ratio, as I mentioned earlier. So, the illustration essentially stated it there. So what proportion of your total income are you spending in order to acquire that food? So if you're going to get a small quotient, then that means that you've got a teeny numerator, or you've got a big denominator, or both. So which one is it? And so let's take a look at income growth in the United States over that exact same period of time, and it looks like this. And it is that Americans are phenomenally wealthy. It's not that the food itself is inexpensive, as we're going to see in just a little bit. Actually, there is no economy of scale that can rescue the way that we produce with food and what we do with it once we've produced it. But we'll get into that in just a little bit. So it means that in terms of constant dollars, the absolute cost of food over that period of time has hovered for all of us on a household basis at a level of about $5,000, if we can have a look at it. So it is that we're very wealthy, not that the food is inexpensive. So that has consequences, and for that, let's take a look at a comparison with various countries of the world. So you see the countries along the x-axis here, and before we actually populate them, let's just make sure that I clarify that the gray bar here is the household income, the average household income in each one of those countries, and then in the red we're going to be seeing the percentage of that income which is devoted to food. So we've seen the figure for the United States already. Now let's populate this, and as it populates, let me just assure you about a question that you're bound to have, and that is to what standard? So this is to the standard of the minimum caloric requirement for a male adult, so 2,000 calories. So that's the cost that we're talking about as calculated by FAO for all of these different countries. So you see that every country in the world can produce food less expensively than in the United States. And these are not cherry-picked. You're welcome to just consult the FAO stat database yourself in order to verify that. But they are picked because they show us some very interesting contrasts here. So when you actually multiply the product here so that you get the actual expenditure per household on average in all of these different countries, there's what it costs. So say outside of the United States, the next most expensive is France, as you probably would expect, but it is a lot less, it's significantly less expensive than in the United States. Now, one more thing that I want to point out about this is that take a look at the figure for the United States, and allow me to play fast and loose with the numbers so that we can do some quick arithmetic, some convenient arithmetic. Let's round up that to $5,000. Now remember that per government figures, in the United States, after we've produced the food, we waste 40% of it. So that's where my 5,000 helps me do some simple arithmetic. So call that $2,000. So now take a look at the total cost of feeding a family in Kenya. It's $243. Let's call that $250. What that means, you've gotten there before me already, is that your trash bin eats better than 8 families in Kenya do on an annual basis. There's no way that with a straight face you can say that you care about the hungry in Kenya, let me waste 40%, and I need to produce more in order to take care of the hungry in Kenya. So that needs to be taken care of. Seriously. Now, these losses are global. In developing countries, in developing country agriculture, the losses tend to be within agricultural fields or in storage. In the United States, there's very little of that, although it does occur, and primarily in fruits and vegetables. But it primarily is losses that occurs actually in the retail portion for a number of different reasons. A lot of our food is simply there for ornamental purposes, to prop up the stuff that really is going to sell at the top of the bins, and to take care of the fact that we have impossibly high cosmetic standards for the stuff that we're actually going to be buying. But, and I'll repeat, so your trash bin eats far better than 8 families in Kenya do. So that's an important thing to keep in mind when talking about this notion of how we need to produce all out because we care about the hungry. So food waste is a big target if you really are concerned about making better use of food. Now, another thing that I'd like to point out about this so that we can then get on to talk about how to improve this is that the United States, for all the accomplishment that I've just referred to, has no business talking about, quote, feeding the hungry, specifically feeding the, quote, 9 billion. It's an insult to the rest of the planet for them to be passive, expecting that somebody else is going to feed them, as if they had no capacity, as if all the assets of the world were the United States to do with and then apportion. That's actually the implication. But more importantly than that, the United States has no right to speak about, quote, feeding the 9 billion until it can feed the 50 million. The 50 million hungry in this country right now. So, you know, obviously we produce way more than we need in order to feed the population of 312 billion, so it's not production. So if you say we need to produce more because the 9 billion, it's like the soup is getting hot on the front burner and you're turning up the back burner. It has nothing to do with the cause of the hunger. We need to understand what the actual cause of the hunger is, which is something that I'd like to talk about, particularly because we do get into very serious humanitarian concerns when we talk about feeding the hungry in the future. So in order to get to that, now I do need to turn into agronomist for just a teeny second, just to put up with me, talk about what agriculture really is. So this is one of the places where we learn to perform agriculture. It's a river delta. And so here's a place where natural forces concentrate at a place where the river floods, the current slows, and it drops a sediment load. It concentrates all of the wealth of minerals and organic material that it is mined from an entire watershed. Another place where that sort of thing happens is at the toe slope, the Piedmont of an elevation. So geological forces do a lot of work of mining the loose soil, the organic material, the detritus, and that alluvial fan is very enriched, and we learned how to do agriculture there. Now, notice that this type of agriculture, which is called runoff agriculture, is possible indeterminately. So if you ask the sustainability question, you know, which is all about performing a human activity that's not bounded in time, about this system, you can intercept this system. This is going to be happening whether human beings are there taking advantage or not. And as long as these geological processes are occurring. And it's serious biomechanical work. Just imagine what it would take for you and your family to take pails and repeat all of that work. So this is what nature is doing, and our original agricultural systems intercepted that, did not interfere with that. The process of geological erosion, the process of water flow occurred. The hydrological cycle was not interrupted. And these sorts of systems, this is the Coachella Valley in California, still continue in many parts of the planet. So these days, we don't just wait until we happily run across an alluvial fan. These days, we find places that are excellent staging areas and then provide whatever missing element is required. So you can imagine this area, which is up in the northeastern corner of Colorado, as being an artificial or a virtual alluvial fan. It's a staging area, and then we provide all of the inputs with which we subsidize the productivity. And then if we ask the sustainability question, which is how long can we keep that up, well, we need to do the same thing as with the question about the syringes. Where's the pap coming from that's keeping this thing going? And so ultimately, agriculture is about securing the access to the inputs that subsidize the productivity of the staging area that we're responsible for. So, for instance, there is energy, there is water, there is land, there is nutrients. As long as there are holes like this that we can mine for potash, there's a big hole like this in the Southwest, there are big holes like this in Florida. As long as there's holes like that that we can keep scratching at, these are probably going to be around or available to us with current technology for about 300 years. As long as there's holes like this one in Benin, in Western Africa, that we can mine for potash, then we can continue doing that. With current technology, these will be around for about 80 to about 300 years. The variability there is huge, and it has to do with how quickly China will become to produce or go online to produce exactly the same way that we do. If they go fully online with corn, soy, meat production, beef production in China, as we have, then it's the lower end of that range. So that's the sustainability question for that linear system, where essentially the input goes through the system, is inefficiently used. As Lincoln would say, it's not thoroughly used. There is waste that creates all kinds of problems on the other end. So this is what agriculture is. You need to actually have the standing army, the economic and the political power to assert your right over that supply of oil, that supply of minerals, the supply of water that's going to be required, and over the land. Because you remember, if you want to have anything you want, whether it's in season or not, from whatever part of the world that you want, and that means that there are fields and there are fisheries all over the planet that are devoted just to producing that for us. Now, granted, not just for us in the United States, but we are the wealthy of the planet. So, for the wealthy of the planet, there are wealthy in other parts of the world who can assert that same economic power. So, we need energy to do this. This is all running on fossil fuel, and so as long as we have places like this that will fix atmospheric nitrogen, then we can do this. And that field of corn that I showed you, just in 1 acre, the elemental content of nitrogen in that corn would be about 1,000 pounds. And it doesn't fix nitrogen from the atmosphere. It extracts it from the soil, and if we want it to produce more than about 80 bushels to the acre these days, then we need to supply a good proportion of that 1,000 pounds. Likewise, for phosphorus, there's about 120 pounds of elemental phosphorus. There's about 600 pounds of elemental phosphate in there. Phosphorus. For a micronutrient like manganese, there might be about 21 pounds. That's for 1 acre. In the United States, there's 100 million acres of corn. Just corn, Now think about soy, sorghum, everything else. So this is serious. The supply lines for this are a very important thing to be able to assert control of. So you can't perform, just think of the global military logistics that taught us how to do this. You can't perform at one end of the pipeline if you're not taking care of the other end of the pipeline. And if you know how to read headlines about what's happening in different parts of the world, you recognize that it's all about positioning for this, to secure the supply of materials in order to be able to subsidize the productivity here, so that then we can do such things as waste about 50 to 75% of the nitrogen that we apply on the fields, and then once the food is produced, waste 40% of that. So I can see that if Lincoln were sitting here listening to this, he would not think that it's a very thorough system. Now, this is a system that works very well for some of us, but as I mentioned, we have no right to talk about what we're going to do for others, which clearly is basically just a marketing slogan to justify all-out production, when in fact we've got 50 million people within the United States that have the same access to food as someone in Haiti or someone in Kenya might have, who need to expend over 50% of their income in order to be able to feed themselves. This is a typical food stamp mother. You can see that in the United States, the rates of poverty carefully track the rate of food stamps. This is 80% of the Farm Bill. D. Hawk, who founded Visa, said that there is no failure so great as a system failing to meet the purpose for which it was designed. So if American agriculture has as its major objective to provide food for its own population, and then the Farm Bill, which is to support agriculture, has to expend 80% of its expenditure, $80 billion annually, then you can see the massive failure here. So the typical food stamp mom is a white woman, single mom with 2 children, is earning about $23,000 a year or less. which triggers her qualification for food stamps or the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. Now, just one more word about this, and that is that it's interesting to ask who the poor are, and then to get past certain facile internal narratives that we have as a population when we take a look at those data. So here's the composition of the United States by ethnic demography, and then let's compare against that who the poor are. And you notice, remember, that tracks with participation in SNAP. So, disproportionately, African American First Peoples, you notice the tremendous disparity among First Peoples, and Hispanics are the poor of the country. And that's particularly interesting when you think about why those folks are here and what their relationship to the food system is. And it's not history, it's the present. And so let's just review that, because again, I promise you, I do want to get to how we can improve this. I mentioned earlier an example of land grabs. So these days, the dramatic headlines about land grabs tend to be in Africa, and they tend to be about China taking over half of Sudan. There's a massive land grab, or Tanzania, headlines like that. Well, that land grab happened here back in the 1860s, and if you include Mexico in that, 1840s. With some of the stories about Russia invading Crimea these days, you're hearing U.S. politicians saying such things as, it's very wrong to invade a country on trumped-up pretexts along ethnic lines, which is exactly the argument that was used when the United States appropriated half of Mexico in the 1840s to protect Christians from that Catholic country. And here you see the subsequent land grab that was consummated. It began in the 1860s, but was consummated in the 1880s. So economists will tell you that the factors of production are land, labor, and rent. If you want to find poor people, they don't have access to at least one of those, and in the most immiserated case, they don't have access to any of those three. So the most immiserated people in the United States are the 2% of surviving First Peoples, and it is no wonder. Their land was taken from them, and so their means of providing for themselves was taken from them. And let's take a look at another very relevant piece of history, not just being facile about the land grant aspect. When I taught in Iowa, and believe me, these were heart of gold kids that I had in my classes, teaching them how to produce corn and soy, they would say things such as, we're just so blessed, to have this land of Iowa. Here are over 120 battles for this land, the Southwest and the Midwest. So, I don't know if people in the Midwest are blessed or not, but I know some people performed some very deliberate actions in order for that land to be in their hands now. Now, I want to say something. I want to be just really clear about this. In order to know what to improve, we need to know why we got to where we are at the moment. So I want you to know the spirit in which I'm reviewing these very important factors as they're connected to the food system. And that is that, I'll just repeat to you words from a very wise man, Regis Pecos, former governor of the Pueblo of Cochiti in New Mexico, who when talking about these sorts of things says, there is no reason to be bitter, there is no reason to be angry, that is behind us. Those were other people, they made those decisions. Now we are here with different people that hopefully can make different decisions, and it's our job to work amongst all of us to make better decisions. So let's just look forward. But we need to know how we got here. Similar situations. So remember, the poor, the immiserated, we just saw the explanation for the First People, have no access to land, labor, or rent. Over a period of 350 years, as you well know, over 12 million people were abducted from their homeland, separated from families, and then brutalized, enslaved, and then systematically excluded from enjoying the benefits of the wealth that their labor helped to create during the plantation era and in the early industrial era of this country. And I remind you, it is not history, it is the present day. So when you look at unfinished business, such as voter registration laws and other efforts to continue to disenfranchise the descendants of these people, that history is very alive. And they were here because they were the manual labor for the agricultural system of the time. And that valuation of labor, that appropriation of labor, continues to the present. In essence, all of the back-of-the-house operations, all the way from harvesting in the field to processing in the food chain to serving you that food whenever you want it in the restaurant, is done by immigrants. Most of them Hispanic. They get paid if they're in a restaurant. You know, there's 10 million of them in this country. They get paid a minimum tip rate of $2.33 all the way up to $5. They are poorer by 3 times than the average population of the United States, participate in SNAP at 2 times the rate as the rest of the population. And the irony of this is that the people that pick your food, process it for you, serve it on the plate, and then clean up the mess afterwards can't afford, for having done that, to put food on their own plates. This is why I say we have no right to be talking about the, quote, 9 billion until this house is cleaned up first. So, we have a lot of work to do in terms of what needs to be improved. So, let me take it back to what we can do in terms of policy. So, if you say that Americans don't need enough fruits and vegetables and ask what would happen if we did, what if instead of investing our public resources, that's what they are, these tax dollars, in the system that I just described, we actually put our money behind the best informed medicinal, nutritional, and scientific information or recommendations, and we actually produced what the USDA recommended that we do. The great news is that the footprint of the system that produces fruits and vegetables as opposed to PAP is a lot smaller, by far, than that second system. So it's a way of sparing land. It's a way of being more thorough, in Lincoln's definition, to eat in a way that is going to create fewer health problems. And, of course, if we did this, then the default system would become one in which the stuff that we are recommended to eat, and which is good for us, would be plentiful. And it wouldn't be that limp, you know, chilled stuff that passes for a salad. This would be flavorful, fresh stuff that your local and regional producers would be able to get to you, provided the appropriate support. We won't get into the calculations on land, although visually you can see, and actually I noticed many of you picked up this infographic outside. You can see the calculations about how little land it would actually be necessary in order to be able to do this. But here's something that I do want to emphasize. So our senior economist and agricultural economist did the thing that economists do. So the net analysis of the winners and losers. Because if you do this, there are people who are going to benefit, namely the people working at farmers markets and so on, and there are people who are going to lose, namely the people that are producing the grain and the people who depend on that supply of grain, some livestock producers and so on. The net is that if we did what the USDA recommends, and then we looked at the ripple effect on the structure of the agricultural system, there would be 189,000 new jobs in local food systems. There would be $9.5 billion in increased sales of healthy food. So economic activity that at present we don't have. That's net, remember. You take the winners and the losers into account. So again, there's benefits to public health, smaller footprint, so great environmental benefits, and then there is this fiscal responsibility of the government's expenditure of our resources for public benefit rather than for private gain. So this is the infographic that's called Plant to Plate that many of you picked up. And of course, it doesn't come free. In order to do this, some of the assumptions that we made would be that there would be certain investment in such things as farmers' market promotion programs, in training programs, in processing, and so on. But the calculation that we came up with is that the government would need to expend $90 million to facilitate those 189,000 jobs and $9.5 billion of benefit, as against the $5.8 billion that costs us $11 trillion in terms of just cardiovascular disease, not getting into obesity, not getting to hypertension, diabetes, and so on. So the contrast couldn't possibly be greater. If you want to read the nitty-gritty and see the actual statistical data, this is the report to look up on our website, which is called the Healthy Farmland Diet, How Growing Less Corn Would Improve Our Health and Help America's Heartland. Now, let's talk about what to do. So this is what we advocate at the Union of Concerned Scientists, and I promise you this will be about the last agriculture that I'll subject you to. It's a system referred to as agroecology. And it is a system that recognizes that, as in that example that I mentioned to you, where if you just simply intercept what is occurring naturally in nature, there are great benefits to reap without interfering with the natural dynamics of the planet. But it is to recognize that there is value in many components that currently we either don't value, don't recognize, or actually destroy. So for instance, that cycle of nitrogen that I referred to earlier is one example of the fact that all of the tricks that matter on the planet are bacterial tricks. So bacteria process that. There's a fractional amount of nitrogen that's fixed due to lightning. It's insignificant in terms of agricultural utilization. So it's bacteria that are performing this, and we do not value that. We do not actually manage the soil to cultivate them, to nurture them, to facilitate their fixation of nitrogen, their enrichment of the soil. It's an area of vast improvement, and if we invested in developing agroecological techniques in the same way that we invested to develop monoculture agriculture over 100 million acres, there would be similar types of benefits for this kind of knowledge. And it would not be that expensive because we've already got the infrastructure. It's out there. And it's an infrastructure that, as I'll mention just a little bit, is kind of trying to figure out what its mission is. So I'll come back in just a little bit to talk about that. Another important cycle that is all completely bacteria-mediated is the carbon cycle. You know, that's the basic life cycle. So whether it's blue-green bacteria out in the oceans or whether it's appropriated blue-green bacteria in plants that we call chloroplasts, they're performing that whole carbon cycle upon which life depends. The sulfur cycle is bacterially dependent, and so on and so forth. Every trick that matters for the existence of higher life, as a matter of fact, you know, only 10% of you is you. 90% of you is actually bacteria that in your enteric system are performing the function of keeping you healthy by helping you to digest the material that you ingest. So it's hard to discount the importance of actually recognizing that bacteria are there, that the majority of them are beneficial, and that they can actually be cultivated for our benefit. That's just bacteria. Let's talk about fungi. Let's talk about organic matter in the soil. Let's talk about managing those things with the same sort of alacrity and joy that we get from manipulating bags of fertilizer and pesticides. And it would be a totally different outcome story, but it is something that we need to learn about. And productivity, let's talk about productivity. This row crop system that we've got is an absolute artifact. And I see that Sam is hoping for me to shut up sometime soon, so we won't get into that. But let me just say that agroecological systems can be anywhere from just a little bit more productive than the row crop systems to as much as about 6 times more productive per unit of land. So one piece of research conducted out in Iowa by Adam Davis and Matt Liebman that you can look up in the Public Library of Science is the so-called Marsden study, which over a long period of time compared crop rotations against the monocrop system and showed that it can be as productive. So this integrated agroecological system, so managing the soil to control pests, closing the nutrient cycle, integrating livestock, was as productive, was as profitable, and required less input, synthetic input, therefore created less environmental impact due to synthetic residues and runoff. So let's talk about the role of land grants, then. I'll be very brief here. So there is a very important role here. You know that the story at the moment is that the land grant system is sort of being pushed into the arms of the corporate sector. Corporate sector is basically receiving that system with open arms. It's a very logical dynamic to occur when public support is being withdrawn from these public institutions. So here's a comparison in billions, in constant 2009 dollars, of what was invested publicly for food and agriculture research and development in 1914 as opposed to what we were doing in 2000. Now, most recent data need to be broken down so you can see what this represents. So this is new. It's increasingly becoming the case that now the corporate sector is filling in the gap and leveraging the massive 150-year public investment in creating the infrastructure of the land grant system. And you cannot fault the corporate sector. If they are paying, then it's their priorities that are going to be looked at. And so I'll just repeat, they cannot be faulted for that. The investment of 32%, which is research and development that's done by universities, is down here in the orange and the green, and USDA is at 12% there. So the total now is $11.1 billion. And by the way, that's just about 3% of the total R&D across all sectors in the country. Now think about that. It's just the food system of the country that we're talking about. 3% of our research and development investment. As if we could not do better with a little bit of effort, and we have the physical plant to do that, but who decides what the questions are? 57% investment. So let's think about this a little bit. I have a recommendation. I think that one way that we could have avoided a lot of what has happened here, if you think about the original mission of the land grant system, it was, and I'm paraphrasing here, to democratize education, to make it available to everyone. And at the time, everyone was a farming rural population. And so it was to democratize education and to improve the standard of living of that rural population. And again, that has been a rousing success. There's all kinds of victories here. We could declare victory and go on to the next thing. But this should not be the next thing. So I think we could have avoided a lot of what has resulted over the last 150 years if we said, if our major objective for this investment is that the quality of life of the rural population improve, then we wouldn't leave the administration of these institutions to technologists. What we would do is get people who are specialized in understanding what quality of life for the rural population is, and they would administer these institutions and direct the course of activities. Rural sociologists should have been the folks that actually coordinated what land-grant universities were about, because that was the mission. And the equivalent today is think of everything that we've reviewed. We have partitioned, fractionated, totally incoherent agricultural policy. Environment is over in the EPA, energy is obviously in the Energy Department, Food and Drug Administration deals with safety, the Environmental Protection Agency deals with environmental impact, the USDA deals with exporting the surplus, this tremendous amount of PAP that we generated. We need a coherent policy that recognizes that there's a connection between production, environment, well-being, as public health. So we need a new purpose. We need a coherent food, health, and well-being policy. This is essentially what Bush and Cheney did when they came into office. They said we need a coherent energy policy, and so they set about creating a task force to create that coherent policy. If we can do that for energy, we should do that for food. So it's either a new department instead of USDA of food, health, and well-being that is coherent around what we ought to be doing with public investment. And you think about ways in which you can engage the public around these issues. If you can go to people and say, we're going to eliminate the need for SNAP in the population within 10 years. We're going to eliminate the needless deaths of 170,000 people due to preventable chronic disease within 10 years. And similar goals like that, think of the public engagement and support that you could get for that. And furthermore, let me drive this home by sharing with you some data that were available in January. These were the top 7 priorities of land grants out of current appropriations for their support. Sums up to a little bit over $1 billion. And by the way, this was an increase over what they'd been receiving over the last couple of years prior. Actually, if you look at the total, it's about 2.3 or 1.3 billion total. So you're in essence looking at the lion's share of this country's appropriations through official channels to invest in agricultural research and development. These were the land grant priorities. Now, I was looking at these data with some of the people that were consultants to the Appropriations Committee who work in the National Institutes of Health. They were reviewing the process. These folks from the National Institute of Health look at this and they laugh. And they laugh because just their research budget is 30 times bigger than this. Health. Now just think how much more powerful both investments would be if they were made coherent. So that needs to occur. So there's need for massive shift. And if agricultural policy ever served just the farmers, that is no longer the case. We're all impacted by that, which means that the agricultural committees that make decisions about these sorts of things should no longer be populated by representatives from just Iowa and Nebraska and Missouri. They need to be populated by the sorts of people sitting here and people coming from cities and people from the public health sector that can inform the government in a wiser way. so it can be more thorough in terms of public expenditure for all these issues, so that we don't throw good money after bad the way that we're doing at present. So there's my suggestion for what the land grant system ought to be advocating for. You would find no stronger supporter than me if that were the direction in which the land grant system went. And so I think we ought to be investing our energies in that way. And I want to leave you with the recommendation of Stephen Gleesman, who many of you may know, one of our foremost agroecologists. Steve has identified over the course of about maybe 4 decades of professional work and 5 different stages of the evolution toward an agroecological system, something that would make sense, utilizing knowledge that we have and that we have the potential to refine and to increase. And so stage number 1 is what currently is in the vogue to refer as sustainable intensification. It's very logical. So if you're going to be buying fertilizers and seeds and making major investments in machinery and so on, you might as well waste as little of that investment as possible. So make the best use of the fertilizer. Make sure that there's as little runoff of that sort of stuff and so on. It just stands to reason. But it's just step number 1. I mean, it's just logical. Stop wasting your money. It's not particularly magical, and it's often just a Trojan horse for let's intensify production as much as we can. So a more sophisticated thing is the stage of input substitution. So let's take a look at that. And so one example might be organic farming. So that instead of using synthetic inputs, then you utilize naturally occurring materials. And this is an improvement, but you can have intensive monocrop organic systems, or you can have major corporations basically usurp the label of organic and produce in a way that is not sustainable. It won't be viable unbounded in time. And so it is better. But say when in the Midwest you take the output of CAFOs as a resource to support organic production, you can see how it sort of defeats the purpose of attempting to use organic production to close nutrient cycles. So step number 3 is designing the system upon agroecological systems, diversity, resilience, closing nutrient cycles, and so on. Step number 4 is the step where you realize, well, wait a minute, that's just production. You actually need demand for that. You need support by connecting the producers to the eaters. So, I wish that we'd had more time to get into this one more deeply, but let me just get you to the punchline here. Step number 5 is this. When you talk to this guy about all these sorts of things, he gets it. But then he says, show me the movement. I don't see political power out there. What is your ask? I don't see an ask that you can define. So I'm proposing a coherent national food, health, and well-being policy. If you put together the constituencies, beginning with sustainable farmers, organized networks that could bring voters to politicians like this who need to see that, National Family Farm Coalition, the Practical Farmers of Iowa, the Carolina Stewardship Council, and so on, you unite those with farm labor groups. Here in Carolina, in North Carolina, you have the Farm Labor Organizing Committee. If you go to the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, if you go to SEIU, if you begin to get labor, the Food Chain Workers Alliance together, if you go to the Restaurant Opportunity Center, get all of those 10 million people enlisted and say, if you could write the policy that you need, which is what every other constituency does, and hand it as a winning platform to a candidate and say, this will give you the edge. You will be competitive in Los Angeles with this platform. And then you connected that to Moms Rising and all kinds of other retail groups that would be interested in this, then that would be political power. Those would be votes. Then he would see it. So he gets it intellectually, but he's not compelled to do it because he does see the $180 million annually that agribusiness invests in order to influence his opinion. He sees that. That's very loud, that's very clear, and those folks are not confused about what they want. So we could do something equivalent. And it needs organization, and it needs vision, and it's what I'm proposing that we all be about. And I started out by promising you that this was all about the American project. Life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, and I hope you've seen that because we're not getting food right, we can't get life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness right for everyone, which means we don't really believe everyone is created equal and has the same inalienable rights till we get this straight. Thank you.
questions, if you would just stand up and loudly project your questions so everybody in the audience can hear it. Yes.
Hi, I'm Joy Williams, and I just really appreciate your teaser in telling us what, in the public, what we should be doing, how we should be thinking about our food, how we should be thinking about rediscovering how we even talk about language, about feeding the hungry. So I really appreciate that, because I'm used to hearing more euphemisms and kind of fluff language to not step on toes. And I think if we're going to really change the culture and the situations that we're faced with, we have to have a little bit more candor in how we talk about this. So I first want to thank you for that and for breaking that ground. And next, I don't know where the question is within this, but I work for the West Carolina Council of Churches, and I do a lot of work with faith and health and trying to build up capacity within churches to even take on a little bit more responsibility within the community, which is something that's not new to the whole structure of faith institutions when we look at our history, but something that will change because of our food system. And so I'm wondering, and as I'm trying to process, going out into the public and talking about the food issues and how to do advocacy, what is a smaller step that I can possibly think about doing as I work up to building an audience? Or even what do I give this audience to do? Like, yes, I can tell them to contact their local representative, but most people don't even know who their local representative or even how to find them. So there's a lot of smaller steps that have to be taken, and I'm willing to do it. I just don't know where to start.
Yeah. So, a rule of thumb with policy is that policy doesn't lead. Policy change follows cultural shift. And all of us are engaged in creating the culture that we want to live in. If you think of all of the major policy transformations in the past, they have come about because at some point we reached critical mass as a population, as a country. We're no longer going to tolerate either a particular injustice or a particular feature about the way in which we do things. So women's suffrage was a case in point. Civil rights, another case in point. Right now we're living through marriage equality, which has reached that same point. So the moment the majority of the population reaches that point where they're not going to suffer injustice against a proportion of the population, then policy necessarily follows. So then what that means, it's about culture shift. And there are lots of examples where that kind of culture shift is happening. They can be catalyzed through local food policy councils, for instance. And the way that they can be described is do the thing that you care about the most. That's the way that a lot of food policy councils get started. Or it could be a stand at a farmer's market, just interacting with people on a daily basis and learning the actual business difficulties of being a direct seller. Some of the examples that I can tell you about, and without blushing, among the land-grant universities, there are just not a whole lot of shining examples. But North Carolina State has a beautiful shining example, and the Center for Environmental Farming Systems, and that what it does is integrated work. It is integrated work that recognizes these difficult complexities. It engages communities. It engages the NGO sector, civil society. It engages the corporate sector, helps to develop business models. It does honest-to-goodness, hardcore research. It's collaborative. It's multidisciplinary. It is the model of what land-grant work ought to be. So doing more of that, seeding that in land-grant universities would be another thing if that's your environment. A great example, I was sharing with a group that I spoke with earlier this morning, is one where in Kansas City, a woman by the name of Diana Endicott, a beef producer, put together a group. They're not really a cooperative, but a group of producers, about 120. They're supplying a local, regional, family-owned grocery store. And it was their own initiative. And the success story that they've had is just amazing. The Food Policy Council in Los Angeles was led by a woman by the name of Paula Daniels. She says the secret to her success was basically leadership, that her Mayor Antonio Virrayagosa, said to her, make this happen. And with that imprimatur, she utilized the city's purchasing power to basically shift the demand for local and regional food in 3 years. And so it's just amazing what she's been able to produce there. Another great story is what's happened in the state of Michigan, the state of Minnesota, following with the creation of a good food charter where citizens and farmers appealed to the state legislature for the kinds of policies that they needed to reinforce local production and sales of fruits and vegetables and value-added products just within the economy of Michigan. So those are all things that then become models that eventually, such as happened with healthy fresh food financing in the city of Philadelphia, you can go to the federal government and say, look, this has worked. Here are the results of an evaluation. Here are the statistical data. Here are the things to avoid. Here are the economic benefits. Here are the jobs that you created. This is ready for prime time. Let's stick it into the Farm Bill or into federal legislation. And there it is now. That's the way that programs such as Double Up Bucks that came out of Tacoma Park in D.C. and spread out to several different markets across the country now have been hardwired into the Farm Bill. So basically, do the things that you care the most about. Learn what needs to be learned, which means make all of the mistakes at small scale. This guy that I showed you 2 slides ago also says, when you go to him with these ideas, he says, show me where this has worked. The country is too big to experiment with. So let's do those experiments.
I'm sorry, but I have to play the role of Grinch, and we need to get Dr. Salvador to another event. I hope you've enjoyed this afternoon. Certainly, we want to thank Dr. Salvador once again for joining us.
Thanks, Ben. Thank you very much. Appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.